Okay, so we are in chapter 2, Born in Captivity, starting on page 40. Any questions on anything before we pick up with the text? Okay. So what we were discussing last time, or where we finished off last time, we're talking about this trait of character, right? And we were using the word character, we were defining it in a particular way, which was to have power and not use it. Right? So the context of the discussion, the chapter is called Born in Captivity, and the section we're in at the moment is called the domestic prison. So it's talking about the role that parents play in children's lives. So what he's talking about here is the fact that naturally parents are at the power end of the relationship when it comes to their kids, just the way things are. He says that it's a trait that all human beings possess, but it expresses here that parents, because they have that power, because they have the capacity to, do this, don't do that, they freely use it. Whenever the impulse or the emotional reaction comes into the mind, there is a admonishing, you should not do that, eat this, don't eat that, this kind of idea. The reason is because the mind is not being governed. Right? So whatever comes into the mind, it then expresses outwardly through the organs of action as speech or whatever. Right? So this is one of the distinctions we made during the last text between humans and animals. An animal has no capacity to choose its actions. Whatever comes into the mind of an animal, bang, it expresses as action through the body. It's unavoidable. Human beings do have the choice of action. Just because something comes into the mind, it doesn't mean it has to come out of the mouth. It doesn't mean it has to express as an action. And so what limits our freedom then is our inability to govern our own minds. It's when the intellect is able to govern the activities of the mind that we widen our scope of action. We can choose to say what has come into our mind, or we can choose to remain silent, or we can choose to say it but in a modified way, approach in a more indirect way. And so he finished off last time with a couple of examples. The one that he finished off was that small fellow bumping into Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Ali saying, oh, sorry. This idea that he's such power he's got, but no inclination to use it at all. And so he continues on. He says, the present day world needs to develop this great human trait, not to use one's strength and power indiscriminately, freely. Children are the most common victims of the abuse of power. It has resulted from the parents' inability to relate to their children. The parents believe the younger generation has turned defiant, aggressive, even rebellious, that they have gone out of control. In many homes, parents and kids have stopped relating to each other. The parents see no fault of their own. They fail to realize the problem of relationship invariably stems from them, from the lack of intellect to assess the psychological traits of their kids. They operate from emotional pressures arising from their clinging attachment and possessiveness towards their children and virtually strangulate the helpless children with their love and care. The parents therefore need to realize their inherent weakness and make a careful study of the individual natures of their children. This is a really important paragraph. This is almost, I could lift just this paragraph out. He says, not to use one's strength and power indiscriminately. Right? So we were, in the previous text, The Fall of the Human Intellect, he distinguishes discriminate and indiscriminate thinking. Right? So discriminate thinking is that thinking which has been passed through the filter of the intellect, as it were. It's been scrutinized. Whatever the thought is, whatever the feeling is, whatever the emotion is, the desire, the impulse, it's being checked. And when it passes muster, it's allowed to go through. If it doesn't reach certain qualities or conditions, it's not allowed to go through. Simple as that. Then it's discriminate. There's a gatekeeper. The problem is when the intellect is not developed and applied, then whatever, as we're saying, whatever comes into the mind gets expressed. This is what he's talking about here. So what's happened is then that there is an inability for, again, staying with this context, for parents and children to relate properly. They lose the capacity to relate. And the tendency is for the parents, as he's talking about here, to blame the characteristics or the behaviour or the attitudes of the youngsters, not recognising that the problem invariably stems from the parents. Because it is the parents' responsibility to relate objectively to the younger. It's not the younger's responsibility to relate objectively to the parents. Same thing with positive emotions. The role of the parent is to seed positive emotions to the young child, not the other way around. It's not the young child's job to generate positive emotions in the parent. Now, that naturally happens. As the child grows from being a baby to a toddler to a young child, etc. It goes through growth phases, and of course there's going to be natural emotional reactions that are beautiful, that are positive. But the moment that we use a relationship for that purpose, then we've completely lost the whole purpose of the relationship. It's no longer love, it's no longer affection, it's now attachment. That person gives me positive emotions. I like those. I want those. And so that's what attachment is. Attachment is love plus selfishness. I want, I want, I want. And so when the parents, again, through no fault of their own, it's coming down harsh on the parents here, but it is through no fault of their own, because how could they have known otherwise? You can't expect someone to know something if there's been no method, no structure, no system to deliver that knowledge. So the children that we're talking about now, who are the quote-unquote victims, they will be the perpetrators at some point, because they also have not been told the right way to relate. They also have not been educated on the nature of attachment, of indiscriminate thinking, of indiscriminate behaviour. So the solution then is this understanding. This is the solution to the problem. Understanding the nature of attachment, how it functions, how it forms, and how it is avoided. And virtually strangulate the helpless children with their love and care. Okay, so he's talking about the emotional pressure. So we feel an emotional pressure. Right? When your neighbour's child acts in a way which is perhaps not exactly what you think is appropriate behaviour, nothing happens. There's no emotional pressure. You might get a little schadenfreude because, my child doesn't do that. Terrible, terrible, terrible parents. But you don't have any emotional pressure when that child acts inappropriately. It just is what it is. But when one's own child acts inappropriately, there is an emotional pressure. Or what you call inappropriately, I should say. There's an emotional pressure to do something about it. That emotional pressure arises from the attachment. That's its cause. So anytime we feel a sense of emotional pressure, anytime we feel a sense of frustration, agitation, anxiety, etc., the cause is one's own attachment. The problem is that we tend to point the finger of blame at the trigger. And there are triggers, of course. We have to accept that there are triggers. But a trigger is not a cause. A trigger is the thing that set my cause into motion. The cause is always internal. That's what it says. The parents believe the younger generation has turned defiant, aggressive, and rebellious. Again, putting the blame on the child, rather than recognizing it's one's own attachment, that emotional pressure, and then the tendency to freely and indiscriminately use the power. Now put yourself in the position of the child. You may have been there, you may not have, you may have been there and can't remember. But as you are now, imagine that there is someone consistently telling you what to do, how to act, how not to act, constantly exercising power and influence over your behaviour. Just because you're an adult doesn't mean that you'll experience it as being more troubling than a child. You're still a human being. You're just a small human being with less experience, less knowledge. But when you're told what to do on a consistent basis, you still feel the same sense of frustration as any adult would. The difference is that they don't have the power to respond. And so there is just this natural building of resentment. And that building of resentment will naturally find its way out. And you see it. You see it, the inability for the children to even speak properly to their parents. The parent could be saying something quite innocuous. Do you want such and such for breakfast? No. Of course I don't. Well, it's a completely inappropriate response. But again, where's it come from? It's come from that pressure that the child is feeling. So the whole breakdown of communication and the breakdown of relationship comes from this attachment. And the problem is that it's being passed on. This way of relating. Do this, don't do that. It's being learned. If that's the only thing you know, then you don't have another option. How will you know to keep your mouth quiet if you've never seen it happen? How will you know to give freedom if you were never given it? You don't learn it, you don't know it, you can't give it. So the virus continues to get passed on from generation to generation to generation in that way. But as we said last week, it's not all doom and gloom. In your faces. People are going to get up and walk out. This is not the way I wanted to start my Sunday. Okay, let's see if we can finish on a high note. All right, so the positive side of it was what we were talking about last week, which is that we do have the capacity to get out of it. Right? We do have an inherent freedom, and we do have the capacity to understand these ideas and move things in the opposite direction. There's no point pointing out a problem if there's no solution. Right? So there is a solution, and it's a very simple solution. There's nothing complex. It's just reflection upon the fundamental principles that make up our own experience. That's all it is. And once you get that, then everything else naturally starts to follow thereafter. So he says, parents need to realise their inherent weakness and make a careful study of individual natures of their children. So this is part of it, recognising I am attached. Okay, I mean, you can't just turn off the attachment because you recognise that it's there. It will continue to linger for a number of days, weeks, months, years, until the work finally breaks the attachment. So while the attachment is there, recognise its presence and be able to discount it so that you'll know that whenever my son does such and such, I'm always going to think it's not good enough. Doesn't matter what he achieves. I'm always going to think he could have done better. Because I'm attached to his success. I'm attached to my son. I'm attached to him being such and such. And so it doesn't matter where he comes, doesn't matter what he achieves, there's always going to be a sense of, yeah, but couldn't you have gone a little bit higher? And so if I know that about myself, I should discount it. Recognise that I've got that inherent weakness. And make a careful study of the individual natures of their children. Why is this important?
Because if we see them for who they are as individuals with their own unique vasanas, we're not viewing them through the lens of our own attachment and our expectations of them.
Yeah, exactly. So the moment we have a clear understanding of who a person is and what that person is, our expectations are commensurate with that. We don't expect the boy who's can barely walk up the stairs without tripping over to get picked for the football team. Because we know he's kind of physically, he's relatively clumsy, he's not particularly coordinated. So I won't expect that he excels when it comes to sports. I happen to know he loves maths. He loves science. He spends all his time reading science and mathematics. So I've got a pretty clear idea that that's where he'll do well. Which is, if my expectations are for sports, if I'm a big sports guy, sports, it's all sports, and he doesn't succeed there, I'm going to have to deal with that. Recognise that I have this inherent weakness. I'm a sports person. I value sporting prowess and sporting skill. He's not. He neither values it nor is he any good at it. It's good that he doesn't value it because he's no good at it. What does he value instead? Where does he find inspiration? Where does he see beauty? What does he want to pursue? Understand that, and then don't have any false expectations.